Netanyahu, in those remarks, said the attacks had been going on since early morning. But I want to know your perspective. Hours into these attacks, reports of hundreds of people injured, and we still hadn't heard from an Israeli official at the time. What did you make of the government's response?
I think we're seeing an astonishing, historic, and almost incomprehensible dearth of leadership. As you can tell, I'm finding it difficult even to find the words. Right now, it is 2 p.m. in Israel. These attacks started before 8 a.m., and Israelis have yet to see a single one of their leaders stand in front of the cameras and actually address them live. Netanyahu made the statement, which you just showed on your channel, in a pre-filmed clip that he posted on Twitter. This isn't actually an interaction with the citizens of Israel, very few of whom could see it. And in the south of the country, you have hundreds of thousands of people with no electricity, with almost no communication, desperately trying to find out what's happening, desperately posting on internal social media sites to find out what's going on. It's an astonishing situation.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. What is the best way for people to follow the developments there, considering that we are basically at war? Is it social media? Is it local television? What's the best way to follow the developments?
Well, for Hebrew speakers, the best way continues to be to follow local radio, local TV that is covering this intensively. But I have to say that not a lot of news is coming out. We found out this number of 545 wounded in hospitals, which is not a complete number. We found that out something like 6 hours into this event, and that was the first communication that came out of the Ministry of Health. For people around the world, I can tell you I'm reporting for this on the Washington Post website live, and other people are reporting. Many journalists remain active on Twitter, but it is difficult, despite there being so many journalists here in Israel and in Palestine. It's difficult to actually know what's happening today. An enormous amount of misinformation or disinformation is also coming out. There are many videos purporting to show Israeli hostages, mutilated Israeli bodies being dragged in Gaza. They look and feel real, but it's impossible to verify any of that right now.
Yeah, and that's one of the hazards that comes with our jobs. Noga, tell me, this attack caught everyone off guard. What do you think the psychological impact is for the people and for the Israeli leadership?
That's, in a way, the $24 million question right now. The attack caught Israelis by surprise and appears to have caught Israeli leadership by surprise. But it must be said, it absolutely has to be said, that the Israeli army has been warning for months of a deterioration in its readiness due to the political upheaval in this country that was caused by the prime minister's attempt to basically change the structure of leadership in Israel. The army has been warning exactly of this, of a multi-front attack that would attack the Israeli civilian population. And the Israeli government ignored the army, dismissed the army. The Minister of Communication said fighter pilots could go to hell. That is a quote, and so on and so forth. Now there's on social media an advisory by one of Prime Minister Netanyahu's actual counsel, someone who deals with the welfare of animals in his office, who says that her nephew and niece have been taken hostage. It's a chaotic situation. It's very hard to imagine that the Israeli government will not be severely damaged by this. But in such a volatile situation, it's really hard to know what will happen.
I'm going to ask you to speculate. If all those warnings went unheeded, Netanyahu, a man who stakes his reputation as a security expert and vows to protect Israel, why do you think he or his advisors would not have listened to those alarms?
They didn't listen to the alarms because they misinterpreted them. They understood them to be political. Netanyahu is on trial for very serious corruption charges. He leads right now a coalition of extremist, racist, religious nationalists who have very little connection to, let's say, strategic reality on the ground, almost none of whom have served in the army or have any experience with these kinds of matters with diplomacy. And he himself has fallen down that rabbit hole. So when he received warnings from the army, his reaction, and this is public, this is not me speculating, was to say the army is allowing itself to be politicized by leftists. And it was convenient for him politically to ignore all of those warnings. I believe, as a result of what we've seen the last few months, I believe it's very likely that any flaws found in army readiness, he will now blame on his opponents. He will say, the protest movement against me has been calling, this is untrue, but has been calling on soldiers not to serve, and as a result, this has happened. That's how I think he's already beginning to shirk responsibility. It doesn't mean it'll happen, right? He could be held to blame for this, but this is a historic catastrophe in terms of Israeli national security. And we're talking about many more dead, many more casualties than what is publicly being stated right now.
Right. We're still waiting for an update on the casualties. Noga, what do you think about across the Gaza border? What does this do for Hamas in its position?
Well, I think, first of all, we should say that for the residents of the Gaza Strip, this is also a catastrophe, and possibly a worse catastrophe than it is for Israelis, because Israelis are, at the end of the day, stronger. I think Israel is going to, it's very likely Israel will actually enter Gaza, will send tanks into Gaza. This is really an enormous cataclysm in terms of Israeli security, and there's going to be an uncompromising response. I assume that Hamas leadership is already, in hiding or in exile or on its way. I find it hard to imagine that they will survive this. This is a huge humiliation. It's not just a disaster for Israel and for Israelis. Their families decimated in Israel by what happened today, but it's a humiliation, and Israel will respond. But for the citizens of Gaza who are ruled by an Islamic militia that is pretty merciless to begin with and will now receive the brunt of Israel's retaliation, I think this is a disaster.
One last question, Noga. I'm guessing we can figure out what the subject of your next piece will be once you get done live blogging. What's the angle of your next piece going to be?
That's a really good question. I think my angle is going to have to be the historic failure of this Israeli government to prepare for a disaster that was written in plain sight.
And finally, Noga, I see the window behind you. Have the air raid sirens calmed down? What's life like outside at the moment in Jerusalem?
No, they haven't. And that's also a good question. What you're seeing are my closed windows that are double windows because I didn't want our broadcast to be interrupted. And I turned off the phone, but you can see here, I hope you can see, these are almost second by second, I'm getting air raid siren alerts from one place or another in the state of Israel. The missiles have not stopped coming in for a good 7 hours now.
Consummate professional with the windows shut there. Noga, thank you very much for talking to us. Noga Tarnopolsky speaking to us from Jerusalem.